Before billionaires ruled nations, before markets decided who wins and who loses, there was a different kind of promise. It said the economy should serve people, not the other way around. And for a brief moment in history, that promise almost came true. After World War II, much of the world was rubble. Cities bombed, factories destroyed, families scattered. But from that devastation, something remarkable happened. Governments didn't just rebuild, they reimagined what society could be. In Britain, Clement Attlee's Labour government created the National Health Service, free healthcare for everyone, and took control of industries considered too vital to fail: coal, steel, rail, electricity. In America, Roosevelt's New Deal spirit still guided policy. Massive public spending, strong labor unions, and financial regulations kept capitalism in check. For a generation, the West lived under an unspoken deal. The state would manage the economy. Businesses would provide jobs, and in return, workers would get a fair share of the wealth they created. And for a while, it worked. In the 1950s and 60s, economies boomed, wages rose, home ownership soared. The average American family could live comfortably on a single income. In Europe, welfare states lifted millions out of poverty. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but for the first time, ordinary people felt like the system was working for them, not against them. It was capitalism with a conscience, prosperity with a purpose. Economists called it the post-war consensus, a middle path between socialism and unfettered capitalism. Politicians across the spectrum agreed on its basic rules. Even conservative leaders like Eisenhower in the US or Harold Macmillan in Britain accepted the welfare state as common sense. It was the golden age of the middle class, a time when people truly believed the next generation would have it better than the last. But beneath that optimism, cracks were forming. By the late 1960s, the post-war miracle was starting to falter. Factories that had once dominated the world faced competition from Japan and West Germany. Governments tried to manage prices, wages, and growth all at once, and failed. Then came the 1970s, the decade when everything fell apart. Inflation hit double digits. Strikes paralyzed public services. In Britain, garbage piled up in the streets during what became known as the Winter of Discontent. In the US, people lined up for hours just to buy gasoline. The word stagflation entered the dictionary. Stagnant growth plus inflation, something economists had said was impossible. The old rules of the economy stopped working, and no one seemed to know why. To ordinary people, it looked like the system was collapsing under its own weight. Governments kept spending to keep people employed, but the more they spent, the less their money was worth. Prices rose, wages fell behind, and faith in the post-war dream began to evaporate. The problem wasn't just economic, it was existential. If the state couldn't guarantee stability anymore, what was it even for? That question opened the door for a new kind of thinker. Not a revolutionary, not a populist, but an economist, with an elegant theory and a simple promise. His name was Milton Friedman, and he believed he'd found the cure for everything. In his view, government intervention was the virus, and the market was the medicine. He argued that if you simply set prices free, if you let competition rule without interference, the invisible hand of the market would guide everything to its most efficient outcome. To politicians trapped in the chaos of the 1970s, this was intoxicating, a simple, scientific-sounding solution to a complex world. Friedman wasn't selling chaos, he was selling order. A world where numbers replaced politics, and efficiency replaced fairness. He called it freedom, but the kind of freedom he meant would soon have a very different cost. Because as the 1970s spiraled into crisis, two leaders, one in London, one in Washington, would take Friedman's ideas and turn them into law. They promised to save capitalism from itself, and in the process, they changed the meaning of freedom forever. By the late 1970s, both sides of the Atlantic were trapped in the same nightmare. Rising prices, falling wages, governments that looked helpless, and a public that was losing faith in everything. Politicians, unions, the state itself. People wanted control again. Markets wanted freedom. And that's when two leaders, one in Britain, one in the United States, looked out at the chaos and saw the same answer staring back at them. They found it in the same book. They called it the free market. Her name was Margaret Thatcher. His name was Ronald Reagan. And together, they were about to change the world. Britain, in the 1970s, looked like a country running out of steam. Factories were closing. Power cuts plunged cities into darkness. Inflation had hit 25%, and labor unions, once the backbone of the working class, had the power to shut down entire industries with a single strike. Newspapers called it the British disease. Thatcher called it decay. She saw a nation suffocating under too much government, too much spending, too much compromise. And when she became Prime Minister in 1979, she vowed to tear that world down, no matter the cost. Across the ocean, Ronald Reagan was watching. America's story was different, but the symptoms were the same. Gas lines, interest rates above 20%, a middle class starting to wobble. After the humiliation of Vietnam and Watergate, Americans were desperate for optimism, and Reagan, a former actor, sold it better than anyone alive. He had a smile, a voice full of warmth, and a simple message. Government isn't the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Behind that smile was an ideology lifted straight from Friedman's playbook. Cut taxes, deregulate, privatize. Let individuals make their own choices and let the market decide what survives. It sounded like common sense. Who could argue with freedom? But freedom, in this new language, didn't mean freedom from want or insecurity. It meant freedom for capital, for money, to move wherever it pleased. Thatcher and Reagan called it modernization. Their critics called it shock therapy. Both would be right. Thatcher came into office promising discipline, and she meant it. Her first budget in 1979 slashed public spending and raised interest rates sky high. She knew what that meant, mass unemployment, and she didn't flinch. Within 2 years, more than 3 million Britons were out of work, the highest number since the Great Depression. Entire manufacturing towns, Sheffield, Newcastle, Liverpool, turned into graveyards of industry. To most leaders, that would have been political suicide. But to Thatcher, it was purification. She believed inflation, not unemployment, was the real enemy. Pain wasn't failure, it was progress. She once said, "Economics are the method, the object is to change the soul." That wasn't just a slogan, it was a manifesto. She wanted to break the idea that the state could protect you, to teach people that survival, not security, was the new virtue. Across the Atlantic, Reagan was carrying out the same experiment, only with a Hollywood smile. In 1981, he passed one of the largest tax cuts in U.S. history. The top income tax rate dropped from 70% to 50%. By the end of the decade, it would fall to just 28%. He promised it would trickle down. It didn't. The wealth didn't spread, it concentrated. Corporate profits soared, but wages stagnated. Unions lost power. The middle class began to shrink, quietly, statistically, and permanently. But on TV, America looked prosperous. The stock market was booming, credit cards were everywhere, and consumer confidence returned. Reagan's charm was his genius. He made austerity look like freedom. He fired 11,000 striking air traffic controllers, just like Thatcher crushed the miners, and the message was clear on both sides of the Atlantic. Labor could be broken, workers could be replaced, and the public would still cheer. For both leaders, the free market wasn't just an economic policy, it was a moral crusade. They believed competition built character, that success was proof of virtue. If you failed, it wasn't the system's fault, it was yours. Under this new faith, poverty stopped being a problem to solve, it became a personal flaw. Unemployment was structural, inequality was natural, and the billionaire was reborn not as a symptom of excess, but as a hero of efficiency. Thatcher called it popular capitalism. Reagan called it the opportunity society. But both meant the same thing. You're on your own now. The paradox of the free market revolution was that it required massive state power to make it happen. To free the market, Thatcher used police to crush the unions. Reagan used the government to enforce deregulation. Both used debt to finance their tax cuts, ballooning public deficits in the name of smaller government. They didn't shrink the state, they repurposed it. The new job of government wasn't to protect citizens, it was to protect capital. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted. The economy stopped being a collective project and became a battlefield. By the end of the 1980s, the revolution was complete. Unions were tamed, taxes were slashed, financial markets were unleashed, and the story that justified it all won the public imagination. Hard work, personal responsibility, individual freedom, these became the new moral language of the age. The world didn't look freer, it just looked privatized. They said the market would set us free, but what they didn't mention was that freedom came with a price tag, and billionaires were the only ones who could afford it. The old world had fallen, and in its place, a new kind of empire was rising, not ruled by politicians or armies, but by money itself. The 1980s didn't just bring a new ideology, they brought a new economy and a new kind of citizen. The promise was simple. If governments stopped running things and private companies took over, everything would become more efficient, more innovative, more free. It was sold as common sense, a quiet revolution that would unshackle society from the slow, bureaucratic hand of the state. But behind the language of efficiency and modernization was something else entirely. A transfer of power so vast it would reshape the world for decades to come. In 1983, Thatcher made her vision clear. The state has no business being in business. Under that slogan, she began the largest sell-off of public assets in British history. Gas, water, electricity, railways, steel, industries built with public money, sold off to private investors often at bargain prices. The British people were told they were becoming shareholders in democracy. Millions bought tiny amounts of stock, encouraged by glossy adverts promising a new age of ownership. But what they didn't notice was that most of those shares ended up in the hands of banks, pension funds, and multinational corporations. Within a few years, the people's capitalism had quietly become corporate capitalism. For a brief moment, Thatcher's Britain looked prosperous. Stock prices rose, profits soared. The City of London, once a sleepy financial district, exploded into a global hub for speculation. But while the champagne flowed in London, the rest of the country was running dry. Factories were gone. Social housing was sold off and never replaced. Public transport crumbled. And entire towns, once built around stable, unionized work, were left with nothing but call centers and despair. Privatization didn't just sell industries, it sold identities. People stopped thinking of themselves as citizens and started thinking of themselves as consumers. The logic was simple. You don't need solidarity when you have a shopping cart. In the United States, Reagan's privatization was less visible but just as deep. Public schools faced budget cuts. Welfare programs were gutted. Public housing was abandoned to the private market. The message was the same. Government is inefficient. The market knows best. But efficiency came at a cost. The deregulation of airlines, telecommunications, and banking sparked short-term growth and long-term chaos. Savings and loan institutions collapsed. Corporate monopolies re-emerged. And by the end of the 1980s, inequality in America had reached levels unseen since the 1920s. The rich weren't just richer, they were untouchable, because the ideology that justified their wealth had become a national religion. If you succeeded, it was proof of merit. If you failed, it was your fault. The invisible hand wasn't invisible anymore. It was a fist, and it always punched down. Privatization didn't just change the economy, it changed how people thought about society itself. Public institutions, schools, hospitals, utilities had once been symbols of collective responsibility. Now they were services. Citizens became customers, and democracy itself began to look more like a marketplace. Voting mattered less than buying. Freedom meant choice, not justice. Milton Friedman once said, "The market is simply the combined behavior of millions of people." But in reality, it was the behavior of a few thousand, the ones who owned everything that had once belonged to everyone. This was the quiet genius of neoliberalism. It convinced people that privatization wasn't theft, it was liberation. You weren't losing something public, you were gaining the illusion of control. By the end of the 1980s, the Thatcher-Reagan model had become a global export. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund began imposing the same logic on developing countries, from Latin America to Africa to Eastern Europe. These were called structural adjustment programs. The idea was simple. If you wanted loans or aid, you had to privatize your industries, cut social spending, and open your markets to foreign investors. And just like in Britain and America, inequality exploded. The Global South was told it had been modernized. In truth, it had been recolonized, not by armies this time, but by contracts. Debt replaced invasion. Trade deals replaced empires. And the free market became the new global governor. By the 1990s, the idea of public ownership had become almost unthinkable. Politicians stopped asking whether privatization was good, only how fast it should happen. Even center-left parties, like Tony Blair's New Labour or Bill Clinton's New Democrats, embraced the free market as if it were destiny. They didn't reverse Thatcher or Reagan, they perfected them. Public spaces became commercial zones. Universities became businesses. Healthcare became an industry. And the very notion of a public good began to sound naive, like a relic from a more idealistic time. But something subtle was happening underneath. As people lost public services, they lost public faith. When everything is privatized, even trust feels like a transaction. Privatization didn't just sell assets, it sold the future. Infrastructure, schools, utilities, these are long-term investments, the scaffolding of civilization. When they were handed to private owners, short-term profit replaced long-term care. Train lines broke down, power grids aged, hospitals cut staff, and when crises hit, financial or otherwise, there was nothing left to fall back on. People began to sense it, even if they couldn't name it. The world was richer on paper, but poorer in spirit. GDP rose, but life felt smaller. That's the paradox of neoliberalism. It promised empowerment and delivered precarity. It gave us choice, but took away control. Because what happens when the market owns everything? Eventually, the market owns you. By the end of the 1980s, the privatization project was complete. Governments had withdrawn from their social responsibilities. The public had been turned into consumers. But the story didn't end there. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new phase began, one that would make markets not just powerful, but untouchable. A world where democracy itself would be rewritten in the language of business. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Communism had collapsed, and with it, something else quietly disappeared. The very idea that there could be an alternative to capitalism. The free market had won, or at least that's what the victors believed. It wasn't just a political shift, it was an epiphany. The old battles of ideology were gone. Now there was only one system, one model, one story left to tell. Globalization wasn't just a policy, it was a worldview. In 1992, a political scientist named Francis Fukuyama published a book called The End of History and the Last Man. His argument was seductive. Liberal democracy and free market capitalism had triumphed once and for all. There would be no more great struggles, no more revolutions, only the slow perfection of what already existed. To many, it felt like the world had finally found its natural order. Markets would regulate themselves. Technology would make life easier. Democracy would spread like Wi-Fi. It was the dawn of a new millennium, clean, frictionless, efficient. A world powered not by ideology, but by economics. But history, as it turned out, wasn't over. It was just being privatized. Through the 1990s, the world's financial systems merged into one. Trade barriers fell. Currencies floated. Capital could flow across borders in milliseconds. New technologies, the internet, satellite communication, and 24-hour news made it all feel inevitable. The global village had arrived. Corporations expanded like empires, only faster and without armies. Nike, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Microsoft, they weren't just brands, they were missionaries of a new faith. Everywhere they went, they carried the same message. Open your markets, deregulate your industries, let capital in. And to countries still skeptical, institutions like the World Trade Organization and the IMF made sure the gospel was enforced. Globalization was sold as progress, a win-win for everyone. Cheap goods for consumers in the West and new jobs for workers in the global South. But behind the optimism, the math didn't add up. Jobs in Detroit, Birmingham, and Sheffield vanished, shipped to factories in China and Mexico. Wealth didn't flow evenly, it flowed upward. And entire nations became dependent on the whims of investors thousands of miles away. The global market was no longer a network, it was a hierarchy. If the 1980s belonged to the industrialists, the 1990s belonged to the financiers. Money itself became the product. Wall Street discovered that it could make more profit betting on risk than producing anything real. Derivatives, hedge funds, mortgage securities, these became the new language of power. It didn't matter if you made things anymore. It only mattered that you could move capital faster than anyone else. The markets didn't just set prices, they set policies. Governments began to treat their credit ratings like sacred scripture. The stock market became the heartbeat of the nation. And when everything, from healthcare to education, was measured in dollars, democracy itself began to take a back seat. Politicians stopped asking what was right and started asking what was good for the markets. That question would define an entire generation. The 1990s were also the birth of a new frontier, the internet. It began as a space of idealism, open, decentralized, democratic. Early tech pioneers believed they were building the ultimate tool for freedom, a world without gatekeepers where information would be free and power would be shared. But very quickly, the market saw opportunity. Startups became IPOs, data became gold, and the digital revolution merged seamlessly with neoliberal logic. Everything could be monetized, even attention. Companies like Amazon, Google, and Apple rose from garages into empires, not by building communities, but by turning users into data points. The internet didn't destroy capitalism, it completed it. Now, the market didn't just own the factories, it owned the algorithms. It knew what you wanted before you did, and it sold you a version of freedom you could carry in your pocket. By the early 2000s, it looked like neoliberalism had delivered paradise. Stock markets hit record highs, credit was cheap, consumer goods flooded homes, everyone seemed richer. But it was a prosperity built on sand. Wages had barely risen in real terms. Debt filled the gap. People didn't own more, they owed more. Governments, too, embraced the illusion. As long as growth continued, they didn't care where it came from. Banks could invent money out of promises. Corporations could offshore profits, and economists called it innovation. The world wasn't getting wealthier, it was getting leveraged. And beneath the numbers, something fundamental had broken. The market was no longer a tool. It was the system itself. It didn't serve society. Society served it. By 2007, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Housing prices skyrocketed. Banks were creating billions in synthetic assets. Everyone was winning, on paper. But the logic was pure illusion. The same freedom that had unleashed the market was now devouring it from within. And when the collapse finally came in 2008, it was swift and merciless. Lehman Brothers fell. Stock markets imploded. Millions lost their homes, their jobs, their futures. The world stood on the edge of another Great Depression. And suddenly, the same governments that had preached the gospel of the free market did something remarkable. They intervened. Trillions of dollars in public money were poured into private banks. The system had failed, but the ideology survived. Because when ordinary people needed help, the market said no. But when the market itself needed saving, the state said yes. In that moment, the mask slipped. Neoliberalism wasn't about freedom at all. It was about power. Who had it and who didn't? The market was never meant to serve people. People were meant to serve the market. But after 2008, something changed. The illusion cracked. The anger returned. And for the first time in a generation, people began to ask, what if this isn't freedom at all? In 2008, the system that was supposed to run itself collapsed. The invisible hand that was meant to guide the market turned out to have a very real fist, and it was holding everyone else by the throat. It started in the most ordinary place imaginable, people's homes. For years, American banks had been handing out mortgages like candy to teachers, truck drivers, single parents, anyone who could sign their name. The loans were risky, but they didn't care, because Wall Street had found a trick. They could take those risky loans, bundle them together, and sell them as safe investments. It was financial alchemy, turning debt into gold, at least on paper. Soon, the entire global financial system was built on those promises. Banks in London, Paris, and Tokyo all held pieces of American mortgages they didn't understand. And when homeowners began to default, the whole house of cards fell. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old bank, filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest collapse in U.S. history. Within days, panic spread across the world. Credit markets froze. Businesses couldn't borrow. Trade stalled. Millions of people lost their jobs. Millions more lost their homes. And the irony was impossible to ignore. The same bankers who had told the world that markets should never be regulated were now begging governments to save them. And governments did. Within weeks, the U.S. Congress approved $700 billion in bailouts. In the UK, the government nationalized major banks to stop a total collapse. The European Central Bank flooded the markets with liquidity. In total, the world spent over $14 trillion rescuing the financial sector. But here's the catch. Almost none of that money went to the people who had lost everything. Ordinary citizens got layoffs, foreclosures, and austerity. Bankers got bonuses. The crisis had revealed something fundamental. The free market was never free. It was just protected. When the poor fail, it's their fault. When the rich fail, it's everyone's problem. Economists called it too big to fail. But what it really meant was too rich to be held accountable. And in that moral collapse, a political one began. After the crash, world leaders promised reform. They said, "We've learned our lesson." But instead of rebuilding the system, they doubled down. Governments slashed public spending to balance the books. Social programs were cut. Welfare shrank. Hospitals and schools lost funding. They called it austerity. In reality, it was a quiet continuation of the same old ideology. Shrink the state, protect the markets, let people fend for themselves. In Britain, wages flatlined for an entire decade. In Greece, unemployment hit 25%. In Spain, entire generations of young people were left with no future. And everywhere, the anger grew. People had watched trillions flow upward while their lives fell apart. They realized the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. That realization would ignite a new political era. By 2011, the backlash began. It started in small camps in New York City's Zuccotti Park, cardboard signs, tents, and a slogan, "We are the 99%. The Occupy Wall Street movement wasn't organized around a party or a leader. It was an eruption, a spontaneous scream of collective exhaustion. For years, people had been told the market was fair, that hard work would pay off, that success was a choice. Occupy ripped that illusion apart. They pointed out what everyone already knew but never said aloud, that the richest 1% controlled more wealth than the bottom 90% combined, that democracy had become a formality, that politics no longer answered to citizens, only to capital. For a brief moment, the mask slipped. And from Cairo to Madrid, from London to Athens, protests echoed the same demand. This is not freedom. But power adapts faster than protest. As the streets filled with fury, the establishment found its counterattack. They didn't silence dissent with violence. They drowned it in narrative. The media reframed the crisis as a story of personal failure. People bought houses they couldn't afford. Governments spent too much. Ordinary citizens needed discipline. And while attention drifted, the same elites who caused the crash consolidated their power even further. Within a few years, banks were bigger than ever. Wall Street bonuses hit new records, and politicians, both liberal and conservative, quietly accepted that real change was off the table. The global financial system was untouchable. It had survived its own collapse. But something had shifted in the public psyche. Faith was gone. Trust was gone. The center, that fragile post-war consensus, began to crumble. And in the void it left behind, something darker began to grow. The 2010s became a breeding ground for political outsiders, populists, nationalists, and demagogues who claimed to speak for the forgotten. In America, it was Donald Trump. In Britain, Brexit. In Italy, Hungary, Brazil, the same pattern repeated. They all told a similar story, that the global elite had betrayed ordinary people, that the system was rigged, That freedom had been stolen not by markets, but by bureaucrats, immigrants, or outsiders. It was a brilliant twist, taking the anger created by neoliberalism and redirecting it away from capital itself. While the public fought culture wars, the billionaires consolidated power quietly in the background. The rebellion had been absorbed into the very system it was meant to destroy. The illusion of the free market had shattered, but its logic still ruled everything. Austerity had turned pain into policy. Populism had turned despair into division. And through it all, the same quiet truth remained. The market was not a force of nature. It was a structure, designed, maintained, and defended. But every structure has its architects, and the next chapter of this story belongs to them, the billionaires who rose from the wreckage. When the markets crashed in 2008, millions lost everything. But for a small handful of people, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. While ordinary families were tightening their belts, the wealthy were quietly buying the world, one distressed asset at a time. In the aftermath of the crash, prices collapsed. Houses, companies, even countries were suddenly on sale. And the people who had the cash, the hedge funds, the private equity firms, the billionaires, swooped in. They bought foreclosed homes by the thousands, entire neighborhoods in cities like Phoenix, Atlanta, and Las Vegas. What had once been a family's dream home became a line item in an investor's spreadsheet. In Greece, public beaches and ports were sold to private investors. In Spain, hospitals. In the US, universities and prisons became profit engines. The crash hadn't just destroyed wealth, it had concentrated it. Within a few years, the richest 1% owned more than half of the world's wealth. By 2020, the top 26 people on Earth owned more than 3.8 billion others combined. And these weren't the old aristocrats or oil barons. They were the new kind of oligarchs, tech founders, hedge fund managers, venture capitalists. Men who believed that the market itself made them moral. If the 1980s had Thatcher and Reagan, the 2010s had Silicon Valley. While the world was still reeling from austerity, a new generation of billionaires promised redemption through technology. Mark Zuckerberg talked about connecting the world. Elon Musk promised to save humanity. Jeff Bezos spoke of a customer-obsessed utopia. It was a seductive idea that innovation could succeed where politics had failed. Governments had become too slow, too corrupt, too bureaucratic. But technology, sleek, efficient, and apolitical, could fix what democracy couldn't. That was the myth. But behind it, the same logic of neoliberalism was at work. Deregulate, disrupt, dominate. Facebook didn't just connect people, it monetized their attention. Amazon didn't just deliver products, it devoured small businesses. Uber didn't just offer rides, it redefined labor as a temporary privilege. They called it the sharing economy, but what it really shared was precarity. By the late 2017, the world's 5 biggest corporations were tech giants, and their power went beyond economics. They shaped elections, public opinion, even the way people perceived reality itself. In the old days, wealth came from land or labor. Now it came from data, the invisible footprints people left behind online. Every click, every purchase, every location ping fed into vast algorithms that knew you better than you knew yourself. It wasn't just surveillance, it was prediction. These systems could anticipate your desires, your fears, your next move, and that power became political. The Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2018 revealed that Cambridge data had been used to influence elections, from Brexit to Trump. But that was only the visible layer. Behind the scenes, the boundaries between corporate data and state power were blurring. Governments were buying surveillance tools from tech firms. Corporations were lobbying for laws that let them operate above nations. The dream of the free market had evolved into something else entirely. A private empire of information, money, and influence that no voter could touch. When billionaires began to face public criticism, they discovered a new strategy: benevolence. They built foundations, launched global initiatives, and promised to change the world. Bill Gates reinvented himself from monopolist to humanitarian. Mark Zuckerberg pledged billions to improve education. Bezos promised to save the planet through green technology. But philanthropy wasn't generosity, it was control by other means. Unlike governments, billionaires didn't answer to voters. Their spending wasn't debated in parliaments or reviewed by journalists. They could shape global health, education, or climate policy entirely on their own terms. In effect, they became unelected policymakers of the 21st century. And their guiding ideology was still the same: that markets and private initiative could solve problems better than states ever could. Even charity had become a profit model. Meanwhile, in the political arena, money became the loudest voice. In the U.S., Citizens United 2010 opened the floodgates for unlimited political spending. Billionaires could now pour millions into campaigns through super PACs, reshaping elections behind the curtain. In Britain, hedge fund donors became major players in the Brexit movement. In Eastern Europe and Asia, oligarchs openly bought media outlets and politicians. Democracy had been privatized. Politicians no longer served voters, they served investors. Policies were drafted by think tanks funded by corporations. Even the language of politics, innovation, efficiency, choice, came straight from the market logic. By the late 2010s, democracy was still a ritual, but not a force. People could vote, but the real power sat in boardrooms, not in parliaments. And through it all, neoliberalism found its ultimate expression, not as an ideology, but as a belief system. The billionaire wasn't just rich, he was a visionary. He didn't exploit workers, he created opportunity. He wasn't hoarding power, he was disrupting the status quo. Every success was proof of virtue. Every failure was proof of laziness. It was Calvinism reborn for the digital age, salvation through productivity. And so the public began to worship the same people who had quietly replaced their governments. We stopped calling them oligarchs, we called them geniuses. They became our philosophers, our innovators, our heroes, men who promised to colonize Mars, cure death, and fix the planet they helped break. It was, in many ways, the final trick of neoliberalism: to turn power into aspiration. By the end of the 2010s, the world had been remade not by politicians, but by private ambition. The market had become the moral compass of the age, and those who ruled it no longer needed permission to lead. But power never stands still. And as the 2020s began, the system they built started to turn on itself. Every system eventually reveals what it really is, not through its victories, but through its failures. And by the 2020s, neoliberalism had run out of illusions. The dream of endless growth had met the limits of the real world. In the lungs of the planet, in the debts of its workers, in the burnout of its citizens. The story that began with freedom and efficiency was ending in exhaustion. When COVID-19 spread across the globe in early 2020, it didn't just bring a virus, it exposed a civilization built on fragility. Hospitals that had been optimized for efficiency ran out of beds. Supply chains that were lean collapsed in days. Workers, once called unskilled, suddenly became essential. And for a brief moment, the truth became undeniable. The market couldn't save lives. Governments had to. Communities had to. Human beings had to. Yet, even in the middle of catastrophe, the logic of profit persisted. Pharmaceutical companies hoarded vaccine patents. Billionaires saw their wealth skyrocket as markets rebounded, while millions faced eviction or unemployment. By 2021, world billionaire wealth had risen by $5.5 trillion. The world's 10 richest men doubled their fortunes as hundreds of millions slipped into poverty. The system wasn't broken. It was working perfectly. The pandemic didn't slow capitalism down. It compressed a decade of transformation into 2 years. Work went digital. Education went digital. Even intimacy went digital. The walls between life and labor dissolved completely. Your home became your office, your screen became your boss, and your time, every waking minute, became a potential revenue stream. This was the birth of what some economists called digital feudalism. Instead of owning the tools of production, people rented them from corporations, the platforms, the apps, the subscriptions, the cloud. You didn't own your software, you licensed it. You didn't own your audience, you borrowed it. You didn't even own your labor. It was streamed through platforms that could erase you with a click. The worker had become a brand, and the brand was owned by the platform. As the world went online, the old industrial capitalists were replaced by platform empires. Amazon became the infrastructure of daily life, not just a retailer, but a logistics empire, a data provider, even a defense contractor. Google and Facebook became the nervous system of civilization, controlling the flow of information, shaping perception itself. Apple built a walled garden where privacy was a luxury. Microsoft quietly reasserted itself as the invisible operating system behind the digital economy. And above them all, a new frontier opened, the cloud, invisible, untouchable, monopolized by 3 corporations. It was a new kind of colonization, not of land, but of data, not of nations, but of habits. The 20th century was the age of industrial empires. The 21st is the age of informational feudalism, where people no longer till soil, but generate data for the lords of the algorithm. Meanwhile, the social foundation that once held democracies together began to collapse. The middle class, that post-war promise of stability, was eroding everywhere. Automation and outsourcing hollowed out traditional industries. Gig work replaced stable employment. Housing became unaffordable, healthcare unattainable, and education, once the great equalizer, became a lifelong debt trap. People were told to adapt, to re-skill, to be entrepreneurial. But how do you compete with machines that never sleep, with corporations that never die? The neoliberal dream had always said that competition brings freedom. But by the 2020s, it brought only anxiety, a permanent state of survival where everyone is their own brand, their own employer, their own product. It was not a society anymore. It was a marketplace of exhausted individuals. In the old world, power was visible. It wore crowns, uniforms, and titles. In the new world, it wears code. The algorithm decides what you see, what you desire, even who you believe yourself to be. It shapes your news, your sense of truth, your very perception of time. Yet you never meet it. You never vote for it. You never even question it because it feels like nature. That's the final evolution of neoliberalism, the merging of power and invisibility. Markets no longer need preachers. They have become the weather, a background condition of existence. But unlike weather, These systems can be changed. They're made by humans, for profit, and maintained by belief. And like all belief systems, they begin to crack when faith runs out. By the mid-2020s, artificial intelligence began to automate not just labor, but creativity, management, and even governance. It didn't just replace workers, it began replacing decision-making itself. In finance, algorithms traded faster than any human could think. In policing, predictive software decided who to surveil. In hiring, machine learning filtered who was worthy of a job. And yet, the more these systems automated, the more they reflected the biases and inequalities of the society that built them. AI didn't liberate humanity, it amplified the logic of capital, efficiency, control, endless growth. And in doing so, it began to make humans obsolete in their own creation. Writers, artists, programmers, everyone was told to adapt once again, to compete with machines, to innovate faster. But beneath the noise, a quiet realization began to spread. Maybe the problem wasn't technology. Maybe it was the system that demanded everything, including creativity, serve the market's hunger for endless expansion. Economic collapse can be rebuilt. Psychological collapse cannot. By the 2020s, anxiety, burnout, and depression were epidemic. Every app, every algorithm, every gig was designed to capture attention, but not to nourish it. The self-help industry told people to meditate, hustle, manifest success, but all that did was turn exhaustion into guilt. When society fails, neoliberalism tells you failed yourself. And that's how it sustains itself, not through oppression, but through self-blame. People stopped believing in politics. They stopped believing in collective action. They began to see themselves as brands in competition, not citizens in solidarity. The system didn't need to censor anyone. It just needed to make everyone too tired to care. And then nature sent the final invoice. Fires, floods, heat waves, droughts, each one a line item in the true cost of the free market. For decades, corporations had offloaded their pollution into the atmosphere, their waste into the ocean, their risks onto the poor. Now, the bill was coming due. But even as the planet burned, the market found a way to profit. Carbon credits, green funds, eco-branded billionaires promising salvation through technology. They called it green capitalism. But you can't buy your way out of a system whose logic is infinite growth on a finite planet. It wasn't green, it was camouflage. By the late 2020s, the contradictions could no longer hide behind optimism. The market that once promised freedom now demanded obedience. The technology that once promised connection delivered isolation. The democracy that once promised choice became an auction. The system had begun eating its creators, and everyone could feel it. The rich built bunkers, the young built movements, and somewhere in between, billions of ordinary people wondered what it all had been for. The age of neoliberalism, once the story of liberation, had become a story of dependency, control, and despair. But buried beneath the collapse was something new. The faint rediscovery of solidarity, of anger that could become action. History had come full circle, and as one system devoured itself, another began, quietly, invisibly, to gestate. The story began with freedom. It became about control, and now it's about survival. But every collapse is also a clearing, a chance to build something different from the ashes. Every empire imagines it will last forever. Every ideology believes it is the final truth. But history always disagrees. Even as the neoliberal order reached its peak, as billionaires conquered space, as corporations grew bigger than nations, as democracy seemed powerless, something quiet began to shift. Not from the top, but from the margins. Not with policies, but with questions. What if the world didn't have to be this way? What if the story of freedom wasn't over, just stolen? For 40 years, people were told that there was no alternative, that capitalism had won, that politics was obsolete, that the only freedom left was to choose between brands. But history doesn't end. It only pauses. And in the 2010s and 2020s, it started to move again. Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, the Arab Spring, #MeToo, Hong Kong, Chile, Nigeria, France, Iran. Everywhere, the same heartbeat. People realizing that the system that ran their lives wasn't natural, it was designed. The protests weren't just about wages or corruption or climate. They were about meaning, about reclaiming the sense that ordinary people could still shape the world, not just survive in it. Neoliberalism's greatest victory wasn't economic, it was psychological. The belief that markets were neutral and that democracy was inefficient. But in the wake of the 2008 crash, that faith began to crumble. People saw banks get bailed out while workers lost homes. They saw corporations evade taxes while public schools crumbled. They watched politicians serve donors, not citizens. And for the first time in decades, a new generation stopped asking how to succeed in the system and started asking why the system exists at all. Writers like Naomi Klein, Yanis Varoufakis, and Rutger Bregman began to challenge the orthodoxy. Movements like the Sanders campaign in the US and Corbynism in the UK reopened forbidden questions about public ownership, universal healthcare, and taxing the rich. The old elites mocked them as naive, but to millions of people, they sounded like the first honest words in a generation. Once, economics was treated like physics, cold, precise, unquestionable. But new voices began to unlearn that mythology. Economists like Mariana Mazzucato reframed the state not as a burden, but as the engine of innovation itself. Kate Raworth introduced donut economics, arguing that the goal of growth should be balance, meeting human needs within planetary boundaries. Movements for universal basic income, public banking, and worker cooperatives began to take root. Even in mainstream circles, ideas once considered radical began to sound pragmatic. The pandemic only accelerated it. Governments printed trillions overnight, proving that scarcity was often political, not natural. The illusion cracked. If the state could rescue markets, why couldn't it rescue people? The neoliberal project was built on privatization, the idea that everything of value must be owned. But a new generation began rediscovering the commons. Open-source software, community energy grids, public libraries, co-housing, and digital cooperatives where value was shared, not extracted. On the internet, new experiments in collective creation emerged. From Wikipedia to Mastodon to decentralized finance projects, trying, however imperfectly, to escape corporate control. These weren't utopias. Many failed, but each failure carried a lesson that freedom isn't about isolation, it's about interdependence. The 20th century told people, stand alone, compete, win. The 21st was starting to whisper, stand together or not at all. Every generation inherits the world their parents made, but this one inherited debt, inequality, and a dying planet. And rather than accept it, they began to rebel. Young people across the globe turned away from corporate ambition and toward meaning, sustainability, and mutual care. Surveys showed that majorities of Gen Z and millennials no longer believed capitalism could solve humanity's problems. They weren't radicals in the old sense. They were realists. They saw the math. They saw the fires. They saw billionaires flying to Mars while cities drowned. And they began to build alternatives, local economies, climate collectives, community farms, digital unions, cooperative housing. Not perfect, not huge, but proof that history's end was an illusion. For 40 years, politics had been reduced to management. Left and right both served the same markets, just with different slogans. But now people began to demand vision. A Green New Deal, universal health care, debt cancellation, public broadband, guaranteed housing. Each proposal was mocked as unrealistic, but the alternative, collapse, was no longer realistic either. Movements from Latin America to Europe began electing leaders who defied the Washington Consensus. Gustavo Petro in Colombia, Gabriel Boric in Chile, Lula's return in Brazil. Even in the global north, ideas of public ownership, post-growth, and climate justice began entering mainstream debates. For the first time in decades, the language of solidarity sounded less like nostalgia and more like survival. Every political revolution begins as a cultural one. After years of irony and detachment, people began craving sincerity again. Films, books, and art turned away from the worship of the anti-hero and toward themes of empathy, care, and connection. Even in the tech world, voices emerged calling for humane design, digital slowdowns, and algorithms that serve people, not profit. The rebellion wasn't just on the streets, it was in the psyche. People were tired of competing. They wanted to belong. And beneath all the noise, a quiet reawakening was happening. The realization that community, not consumption, was what made life worth living. Utopia used to be a dream. Then it became a joke. Now it's returning as a necessity. Because if dystopia is profitable, utopia must be built deliberately. All around the world, small laboratories of the future are emerging. Citizen assemblies, degrowth towns, post-carbon cities, worker-owned tech startups, and local currencies. Tiny, fragile, often ignored, but they exist. Each one an act of defiance against a system that says there is no alternative. History whispers back, there always is. The future wasn't canceled. It was privatized, and now it's being reclaimed. The dream of a world beyond markets, beyond extraction, beyond billionaires, is no longer fantasy. It's necessity. But revolutions don't begin with certainty. They begin with faith that something better can still be built. They said freedom would make us strong, that if we unleashed the market, dismantled the state, and trusted competition, we'd build a world of innovation, prosperity, and choice. And in a way, they were right. We did build that world. But what kind of freedom was it when everything you needed to live, a home, an education, healthcare, had a price tag you could never quite afford? What kind of liberty is it when the only way to survive is to sell more of your time to someone who owns your future? What kind of democracy is it when wealth can speak louder than any vote? In the world Thatcher and Reagan built, freedom became the brand name for dependency. You were free to work, but never free from debt. Free to speak, but unheard in a media system owned by the powerful. Free to choose, but only from the options the market allowed. It was a beautiful trick. They sold obedience as self-expression. They sold isolation as empowerment. They turned the cage invisible and called it freedom. And for decades, the world believed it. The story that began in the late 1970s with two leaders promising to save capitalism from collapse has now come full circle. Inflation is back. Housing is unaffordable. Labor unrest is rising. And once again, people are being told there is no alternative. But this time, the illusion is harder to sustain, because now everyone can see the wires. They can see how billionaires grew richer during crises, how the planet pays for profits, how democracy shrinks as balance sheets expand. And they can see, maybe for the first time, that this isn't about personal failure, it's about design. For 40 years, neoliberalism taught us that freedom was an individual project, that liberation meant escaping dependence. But humans aren't machines. We depend on one another, on care, on trust, on shared institutions that protect us when life collapses. Markets don't create those things. They consume them. The real cost of our freedom wasn't just inequality. It was the erosion of belonging. The price of a borderless economy was a borderless loneliness. We were told we could each be our own savior. But it turns out, no one is free alone. Look at the world now. Billionaires are no longer business people. They are states. Platforms are no longer companies. They are infrastructures of human attention. Money itself has become political speech. The map of power isn't drawn by borders anymore. It's drawn by networks, servers, trade routes, data centers, supply chains. And while nations debate budgets, capital moves at the speed of light. That's the new geopolitics. Not ideology versus ideology, but sovereignty versus scale. The freedom of the few, built on the subjugation of the many. Every system carries the seeds of its own undoing. For feudalism, it was trade. For monarchy, it was reason. For neoliberal capitalism, it's inequality. So vast, it collapses the myth of merit itself. You can't tell people to work harder when the top 1% owns half the planet. You can't sell the dream of social mobility when the elevator's been rigged. And you can't call it democracy when money writes the laws. So the question isn't whether this system will end. It's how. And who gets to build what comes next. The paradox of freedom is that it's never given, it's made. And it's always collective. The market offered one kind of freedom, the freedom to compete. But there's another kind, the freedom to care, to belong, to build something together that no one owns. That's the kind of freedom Thatcher and Reagan couldn't imagine because it doesn't fit on a balance sheet. It's the freedom of the commons, of democracy, of solidarity. And if the last century was defined by the struggle between labor and capital, the next will be defined by the struggle between capital and community, between the world we inherited and the one we choose to build. History doesn't repeat, it compounds. The choices of one generation become the constraints of the next. Thatcher once said, "Economics are the method. The object is to change the soul." She succeeded. But now a new generation is rewriting the equation. Because the soul she tried to change, the belief that people are nothing but competitors, has begun to rebel. And that rebellion is where the next story begins. The market didn't set us free. It taught us what freedom isn't. Freedom isn't the absence of rules. It's the presence of justice. It isn't owning more. It's needing less. It isn't individual success. It's collective survival. The price of the last 40 years has been paid in trust, in time, in lives. But the bill is almost due. Because the future, real freedom, was never meant to be bought. It was meant to be built. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe, not for algorithms, but for answers. History built this world, and history can build another.